Why did God kill people in the Old Testament? I think the big question is, if God is loving, how could he do this? Like, how could a loving God kill anyone? And I think there are two ways that we look at this. There's instances that it seems like it's murder, and then there's a couple instances where it seems like it's genocide. So I want to unpack both of these. This is my theology journal. I am by no means a theologian. I don't have any accreditation or anything like that. I am just researching, studying, and I want to process what I've been learning, more so just for me. But if it helps you and answers your questions, then awesome. But the first thing that we have to understand is that God is loving and he is just. So if we can't hold those two things in tension, then it's going to make this whole video, you're just not going to agree with it. You're going to be like, oh, whatever. I'm going to explain that a little bit at the end, but God is loving and just, and as a loving God, he has to have justice, and as a just God, he still loves. So it's like one doesn't negate the other. So we have to understand when we're looking at these stories and these instances that just because God is loving doesn't mean that he's not just, and just because God is just doesn't mean that he's not loving. So when God commanded destruction, it was because of moral corruption and spiritual rebellion. There's a couple instances where we see God respond to violence and oppression. That's with Noah. In Genesis 6, people are evil. There's a lot of violence, so God responds by sending a flood. Then we see God respond to child sacrifice and prostitution, and we see him respond to idolatry that destroys human life. They were literally, back then, they were sacrificing their sons, their daughters, their children to idols. That God hated that. He despises evil. So he responds to those acts of evil. And when God told the Israelites to attack and destroy and drive out the Amalekites and the Canaanites, it wasn't just a random slaughter. It was God responding. It was God confronting evil and showing that he is the one true God. It was him showing that he was judging the sin that was destroying humanity. That's what this was. Because we label it, we read those two. There's two accounts. There's the account of the Amalekites and there's the account of the Canaanites. That a lot of people are like, God commanded genocide. He said, wipe them out, destroy them. But we have to look in context and understand, okay, first of all, genocide is ethnic cleansing. This wasn't about ethnicity. God wasn't trying to wipe out certain ethnicities, because Rahab was a Canaanite woman that God spared because she repented, that God spared because, and she is now in Jesus's lineage. And then if we look at Ruth, she was a Moabite who is also in Jesus' lineage. And then Nineveh, if you think about Nineveh, the whole city where Jonah is supposed to go preach, Jonah goes to preach to them and they repent, they return to God, and he forgives them. And then later on they fall back into evil, and then God has to judge them. But it wasn't about ethnicity. God wasn't trying to wipe out a certain ethnicity off the face of the earth. He was responding to sin. He was responding to evil in the world and had to bring justice because he is a just God. So the Canaanites, who were they? They were people that lived in the land that God promised to the Israelites. And they had 400 years while the Israelites were in slavery to repent and to turn to God and to live for him. But they just had so much evil going on. There was so much sin in their life. So that when Joshua comes out of Egypt, when they are about to enter into the land, he's coming and he's attacking a culture full of violence, child sacrifice, idol worship, prostitution, all of these things that God hates. So Joshua is working with God to take back what was already promised to his people. God had promised them that they would live in that land. So with God, he's going and taking back the land that he had promised. And he's giving them judgment for the 400 years of evil that they carried out. Then if we look at the Amalekites, these were people that when Israel was at their weakest, when they had just escaped slavery, the Amalekites kept attacking Israel, and they targeted the elderly and the people that would fall behind. So I can only imagine that they are targeting the elderly and the women and the children, the people that are falling behind as the men are leading the way. They're attacking them, and God swore that he would bring justice and remove any memory of them from the face of the earth. That's what he promised. He says, I am going to judge them because they are constantly attacking me, constantly attacking my presence. So again, it wasn't about race. It wasn't about ethnicity. It was about responding to evil. But here's what I think that we're actually missing. I think when we look at this, we're looking at it through today's cultural lens. I look at it and I'm like, yeah, that looks like genocide, because that's how we would recognize it. That's how we would acknowledge it. But we have to look at it through their cultural lens. We have to understand their world. So back then, every nation was theocratic. What that meant is that God was the one that was ruling the nations. It wasn't government, it was God. So God led everything that they did. So every nation was ruled by God. The government was ruled by God. So when an army went to war, or when a nation went to war, it wasn't just an army versus an army. It was God versus a God. So whichever nation won, that God was more powerful. So Egypt, they fought for Ra. That was their God. Babylon fought for Marduk. I don't even know if I said that right. Moab, their God was Chemosh. Not even sure if I know what I'm saying. So that was what they believed. It was God versus God. So to everyone back then, it wouldn't have seemed like genocide. It would have just seemed like a nation that lost because their God was less powerful. So when God brings the Israelites up out of Egypt, they are at their weakest, their lowest. They don't have an army. They don't have chariots, horses. They don't have all the things that everybody else fights with. They fought with God on their side. God is coming to bring judgment and to show all the nations around them that he is the one true God. God didn't free them to come and dominate the world. He wasn't like, I want you to take over, take back Egypt's empire, take back all of this. He wasn't trying to do that. He just said, hey, I want you to come back. He was bringing them back to the land that he had promised 400 years earlier, back in Genesis 15. That was what God was doing. He was taking back what he had set aside for himself. He wasn't commanding genocide. He wasn't trying to ethnically cleanse anybody. He was bringing judgment and justice, and then taking back what was his. And the only difference with the Israelites doing it and then other nations doing it is that they weren't doing it to be violent. God wasn't like, I want you to conquer the entire world. They were just reclaiming what was already promised to them. So God wasn't commanding genocide. He was bringing judgment, and he was reclaiming what was already his. They had the nations that the nations that they fought were nations that had 400 years to repent, but they refused. So he brought justice, took back what was rightfully his, and was showing them and all the other nations that he is the one true God. And most people get caught up. This is where most people get caught up, is in the words. It's like there's wipe out, drive out, destroy. And it's like, well, what does God mean by this? What does he mean by that? But the point is his heart. The point is, what was God actually doing in this? God is love and he is just, but because he is loving, he has to bring justice. He was confronting evil in a world where this was how judgment was expressed. War was how justice was expressed. So no one would have been surprised. They would have seen this action. They would have seen God's actions as justice, not cruelty. We see it as cruelty from our lens because we don't understand the culture back then. So we're just missing it. It's just a cultural misunderstanding. And if we really think about it, God's justice reveals his love because he was destroying the evil that was destroying humanity. He hates that they were sacrificing children and doing prostitution and having all those things. God hates that. It grieved his heart and it was evil. So God, in his love, had to bring justice against those nations. So was it genocide? No. It was justice. It was taking back what was his. And he, along the way, spared people that repented. Rahab literally repented. Rahab believed in God. It says, you could go read the story in Joshua. She hears about how the Israelites are destroying all the other nations, and she's afraid. They're all afraid. They know that God, we know that your Lord is Lord, and I'm afraid. So she brings him in. She's like, promise that you'll just spare my family. And because of that, now she's in Jesus' lineage. Now, why did God kill people? I think this one is a little bit more interesting because we see a couple different accounts in the Old Testament where God just like, boom, kills someone right then and there. And you're like, dang, it's kind of scary. But again, we have to remember that the Bible wasn't written to us. It was written for us. It was written to a different people at a different time in a different cultural context. So they would have an understanding of it. We are looking at it through our lens and we're misunderstanding it because we're not seeing it rightly. They lived, again, I said already, they lived they had a theocratic system. It was like the government was run by God. Everything was run by God. He was their direct ruler and lawgiver. And when he acted, it was expected justice from a king. It was like if a king was ruling and giving out justice. That's what they expected. So it wasn't uncommon for them. So every time God judged someone, it was to protect the holiness of his people and it was to protect the purity of his presence. Because if sin and corruption went unchecked, then it would destroy everybody. So we have a couple examples. There's Nadab and Abihu. They were two priests who gave unauthorized fire in God's presence right after God revealed his holiness. So God struck them down to show that His presence is holy. It's not casual. It's not like chill. It's not common. He was protecting his holiness. He's like, I want you to have an awe of me. Then there's Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in Numbers 16. The Nadab and Abihu's Leviticus 10. In number 16, they rebelled against Moses and challenged God's authority. God put Moses in charge, and they're like, hey, we could do it better. We should blah, blah, blah. So then God judges them. It was a warning about rebelling against the rulers that God puts in place and rebelling against God's order. Then you have Achan in Joshua 7. He stole from Jericho things that were supposed to be devoted to God. So God judges him to show that sin infects a whole nation. They all lost the next battle they went to because there was hidden sin in the camp. They had to deal with it. So God dealt with it. And then Hophni and Phinehas in 1 Samuel, there were Eli's son, who's the priest, who anointed Samuel. But they corrupted worship and used God's house for sin. They were sinning in God's house. So God removed them to cleanse his priesthood and restore purity and leadership. So all of those things, it was God protecting his holiness and it was keeping purity. So every single time that something was attacking that, God had to issue judgment. He's just. We don't understand it, but back then, that was expected. It was a king issuing judgment. But then here's the thing, okay? Every time if sin or corruption were to go unchecked, it was going to ruin humanity. And that's what happened because they were like, we don't want God to rule us anymore. We want a king to rule us. So instead of having God ruling them, God stepped back and said, okay, you can have a king, but here's the thing. He's going to oppress you. He's going to ask you to do this. He's going to ask you to do that. And he's telling them everything that's going to happen. So the last people that were killed by God and his justice were Hophni and Phinehas in 1 Samuel. God steps back, lets them have a human king. And then chaos happens between 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. You see just the collapse of people living in sin and evil and all of those things because God wasn't there to issue judgment. He left judgment and justice up to the human king. They didn't want God to rule, so God stepped back and let them have their way. But in 2 Samuel, when God had to protect his presence, that's when he acted. When it came to his presence, he still issued judgment. The guy goes to touch the ark to save it from falling over. They're carrying it back on carts, whatever the context. You can go look at it. So he touches the ark to steady it, and then instantly he dies. Because God is showing us that that he is holy. And it's hard to understand. I understand. For me, it's hard to grasp. For me, it's hard to wrestle with. But it's like, he is just. I don't always understand his justice, but I know that he is good and that he is loving and that I can trust him. So all of that to say, did God kill people? Was that murder? No, God didn't murder anybody. It was justice. Did God ask for genocide? No, God wasn't asking for genocide. Again, it was justice and he was taking back what was his. Every time God acts, it's in response to rebellion. It's in response to evil. Every time he did, it was to protect the purity of himself, of his holiness. That's what he was doing. And does God still keep people today? Does God still kill people today? No, he doesn't. But the question is like, well, if God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, does that mean he changed? Why doesn't he kill people now? It's because of Jesus. You might have already guessed that, but it's because of Jesus. God is still holy. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is still holy. He still hates sin. But the difference is that judgment for sin already happened. On the cross, Jesus took the full wrath of God. He took the full judgment for sin so that you and I don't have to pay that anymore. So the penalty of sin, which was death, we see that in Romans 3, and we see it in these examples where the penalty of sin, the penalty of doing wrong and living evil was death. The penalty of sin wasn't just taken, like it wasn't like it just disappeared all of a sudden because of Jesus. No, he paid for the penalty. He gave his life and he died for you and for me so that we could live. Did God commit genocide and murder? No. They weren't acts of cruelty. They were acts of justice. And what looked like murder in the Old Testament was justice on display. And what looked like murder on the cross was God's love on display. God is both loving and just. And a just God can't excuse sin, but a loving God doesn't leave us trapped in it. In his justice, he judged sin. But in his love, he took that judgment on himself. I know I went all over the place. I hope this was helpful. I was just trying to word vomit and process everything that I've been learning. Let me know if you have questions. I want to help. I want to dig into this. I love this stuff. And in the next video, I'm talking about, did Jesus claim to be God?